My first and only real job was working, or after college, was working in a warehouse for a major fashion designer. Within a few months, I worked my way inside, and that's when I started to pay attention to what was happening out at retail. And I noticed that there was a lack of cool accessories. So I decided to start a side project to capitalize on a portion of that market. And it was an idea that I had had in college. So working at my day job and working on my side business wasn't a problem. The problem was I was broke. I wasn't making very much, and what I was making, I was barely getting by and paying my bills and trying to fund a startup. After struggling for a few months, it really wasn't going anywhere, and so I did something I decided I really didn't want to do. I was going to ask my dad for money. Now, my dad had just, in all fairness, had just paid for my college, and here I am going back to the well again, right? But I pushed past my nervousness and put my pride aside for the better of my business, even though I knew that what I was going to say might not be well received. So a few minutes into my feeble attempt at a pitch, and he stops me and he says, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You have a company that you make wallets and handbags, and you sew animal characters on them, and your partner is a guy you met at a newspaper stand. And there he is. We'll get to him in a minute. So when I heard that back, it does sound ridiculous. And so I was deflated. And his words sank deep. And I started, so our conversation ended pretty much right then and there. And I never asked him for that loan after all. So I started to replay our conversation. And I started thinking about it. Was I not good enough? Was I not smart enough? Or did he not believe in me? Or maybe he believed in me so much that he figured I would just figure it out on my own. Did I mention the most important thing? My dad himself is a serial successful entrepreneur. That didn't make any sense. So wait a second. Why is a corporate job okay for me, but it wasn't okay for him? Well, I was never emotionally ready to ask that question. And so I didn't. My dad had a right to be skeptical because here at Chapman University, which is actually where I went to school, I had a serious lack of direction. And it was during my studying here at Chapman that I had a chance encounter that would change my life forever. I was studying during my senior year, I was studying at a local coffee shop. Next to it was an international newsstand. And I would wander over from time to time, and I would check out the international fashion magazines. It was there that I came to know the cashier, a guy by the name of Paul Frank Sunich. One day, Paul and I became friends over time because I kept having to study, and so we became friends because I didn't really like studying, and I liked going and reading the magazines a lot more. And one day, out of the blue, Paul says to me, "I'd like to make you a wallet." And that's kind of different, right? He was the first guy I ever even met that knew how to sew. His offer was genuine, and so I said, okay, let's go with that. And so I came back a week later, and Paul had sewed me a wallet that looked similar to the one you see there. And it was pretty impressive. And that gesture wasn't lost on me. And so I offered him some money, and he said, "I made this for you because you're my friend." Again, a very endearing gesture. So the next time Paul and I met, he pulled out this red vinyl handbag that he had hand-sewn for his girlfriend to match one of her dresses. And that was my light bulb moment. That's when I knew I had to work with Paul. And I turned to him intensely, and I said, "Would you like to start a company with me? You and I need to be in business together." And I didn't know what that really meant, but seriously. And so Paul sheepishly smiled, and he kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he said, okay. And so we set up shop in my detached garage. Lovely first place. And so Paul brought in his sewing machine, a work table, and an anvil, and some spare vinyl scraps, and began making wallets and handbags and backpacks in my garage. And so now I'm working at my day job, and Paul's sewing these items. And when he'd have about 10 of these items made, we called that our inventory, I would take those items and I would go to a local surf shop or a boutique and try to sell them. And I did. And I'd come back with our profits, usually about $100. And I would give the money back to Paul. He would buy more material, and so it went. But there was a couple of things that were happening in the garage during those days. The items that we were creating inadvertently over that year's span became our debut collection. The other thing that was happening was we were creating this pent-up demand because you either had to know Paul or myself to get one of these items. It was only sewing one at a time. So I'm working, and I really am. I'm in my day job, but my mind is drifting to my garage, and I'm wondering what's happening there, and my passion clearly lies there. And so one day, I did something big, and I jumped. I quit my job. I had 3 months worth of savings and a small 401k. I didn't have a plan B, and I was so naive, I never really even thought about it not working. And luckily, so now I'm on, and luckily at that time, our third partner had come to us. Those are the items we're making in the garage. Our third partner came to us. He was a friend of mine. He said, "I'd like to give you $8,000 and be a part of what you're doing." And I was like, "Yes, you're signed up." And so I went to Paul and I said, "Hey, my friend would like to give us some money and provide some business structure." And Paul said, "No." And I said, "Paul, let me explain this to you. You and I, we own 100% of nothing." And when I put it to Paul that way, he said, "Okay, I understand." And so now there was 3. And so we took that money and we invested it. We made sample lines, and we got a small office now. We put a deposit on a trade show booth space. But we didn't have any money to pay for a booth builder. So we actually built the booth by hand. And we built a house, and we literally built a sturdy house. We built it in pieces. We loaded it in the back of a borrowed truck, drove to our trade show. We set our alarm clocks for 2 o'clock in the morning. We arrived a couple of days early. And we snuck our trade show booth in because we couldn't afford to match the union fees. We literally rolled our trade show booth in on our skateboard and set it up in the middle of the night. Can they come after you like 15 years later? I don't know. There's the booth. We actually won Best Booth. So not only did we win Best Booth, but we booked $500,000 in 3 days. And yeah, so I had this moment where I'm there in front of the booth and there's like tons of people and I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm totally rich." And it could not have been further from the truth, right? But it was a nice validation for the efforts of the 3 of us and the fact that I had left, and it felt good. So our relation quickly turned to panic when we realized that in order to make $500,000 worth of orders, we needed $250,000 worth of capital. We didn't have it. We had about $2,000 in our account. So we had went to some banks, and they were going to loan us $50,000, but that just wasn't going to get it done. So we had a problem. And so we threw a Hail Mary pass. We contacted a Japanese businessman that we hardly knew. We explained our situation, and for some ownership percentage, he wired, without a contract and just a handshake, he wired the money in. That stuff doesn't happen. Just you entrepreneurs out there, that's not how it goes. But it happened for us, and so good for us, I suppose. So that year we went on, and we booked $1 million that year, our first year out. And the product was, we were the darling at retail, and we had a really fantastic run. And we actually were growing so fast that we ran into an entirely new problem, which was a cash flow issue, where we needed more money to continue to expand our line. This time I went to my dad, and my ask was even greater. I asked him to co-sign on a loan for $500,000, and he did. And he did that because he had seen with clarity that we had passed all the early hurdles that startup companies falter over. And he had seen our balance sheets and was, intimate with our financials, and so it wasn't that big of a decision for him to make. And so once he did that, we were still on the hook, but it was an incredible time for the company. We grew and we grew. We expanded product lines. We sold in 60 countries. We had 30 of our own Paul Frank stores. It was a great time. So you might be asking yourself, well, how did you get out of the garage when you could barely make rent? Well, remember that loan that I was going to ask for? So my stepmom was there, and she overheard my conversation with my dad, and she heard me get shut down. And she pulled me aside, and she herself was a retailer. And she said, how much do you need? And I said, well, we need $5,000. And she liked what we were doing creatively, and she got it. Without hesitation, she pulled out her checkbook, and she wrote us a check for $5,000 back then. And I'm pretty sure without her generosity, we might not have made it another month. So I'm grateful for that. So now that I've moved on from Paul Frank, it dawned on me that I had never gone back and followed up on that loan that never was with my dad, nor did I ever ask him the reasoning behind that conversation. And so I called him in preparation for this talk today, and here's what he told me. He said he feared that the genes of an entrepreneur perhaps might skip a generation. I don't know if that's a good thing. Anyway, so he told me that he had a certain script for me and that I wasn't following his script. And he also admitted that being an entrepreneur himself, he'd seen the hardships that entrepreneurs face, and ultimately he was just being protective. And lastly, he said that I knew that if you really wanted it bad enough, you would figure out a way to get it done. And Dad, I did. So now that I'm a dad, I wonder what decisions I'll be faced with when I'm holding my children's dreams in my hands. But thankfully, I've got 17 years to figure that out. Thank you.